Hi, welcome to Understanding Conscious Cryptids with me, Khat Hansen, your host. Hi everyone, welcome to Understanding Conscious Cryptids. Well, everyone was asking for part 3 of the giants. So here we go. I want to be very specific about these giants, okay, about what I'm talking about here, because I got some emails and people seemed a little scattered and not understanding everything that I was trying to say. So I want to kind of back up here and I want to reiterate some things, okay? The big, tall 23-footers and above, 26-footers, maybe even taller. These guys are some of the originals, not all, okay? People need to remember, like I've said, that this planet is 4.5 billion, with a B, billion years old. So you can only imagine how many civilizations have come and gone. Okay? Also, you need to understand that those very same civilizations that came and went, some of them found openings in the earth and decided to live underground because it was in their best interest. Because human beings are not the only ones to have a lineage, line of people, of beings that we have descended from. These guys did too, you know, and we also have multiple lines of, I guess we could say, life forms here on this planet, because Gaia is very conscious. And she is a creator of things that exist on her as well. So she likes to mimic Heavenly Father's designs because she finds them very appealing, aesthetically, whatever you want to say. She is just fascinated with them, and she has continued her own ways of creating beings for this world in the pattern that was created by Heavenly Father. So she likes this pattern. So she creates beings that walk on 2 legs. She creates beings that have 2 arms, 2 eyes, a nose, you know, that look very humanoid-ish. Okay? So we have those. Then we have the big giants. And we also have the ones before them. This world was destroyed and created, and I know a lot of people don't get that. You know, a lot of people believe just exactly what's left of the Bible that they read. Well, 50 books were left out of the Bible. Okay, and some of them were accepted for, you know, a long time as the norm for belief. You know, they were left in, and Christians read them and understood them. So you're not getting the whole picture here. You know, when you're being told, oh, there's only a set number of humans and this is how they evolved and this is the way it is. That's not true. It's not true. And one of the nice things about Native American history and other histories out there is that they've been kept to the point where they want it remembered, you know, and how important it is to remember it. So they entrust their people, certain people, with the information because they know that it's going to be dispersed to whomever needs it and can understand it and appreciate it and remember it and go forward with it. Okay, so that being said, I want to talk about these giants that seem to be everybody's passion right now. Okay? When the settlers came to the North American continent, there were an estimated 200,000 cairns and hills that were shaped in the form of a cone. Okay? These had already been accounted for as the settlers began to colonize the North American continent. Okay? They had in them large remains. Okay? Not only were the beings that were in them large, but these hills and these cairns were massive. Okay, so people, when they try to understand and wrap their brain around this, you know, they always tend to think of, you know, something like Cahokia, which is very large. But I like to steer people in a little bit different direction. Okay, we're talking massive. And when I say massive, I mean whole villages were built on top of these mounds. Okay? These mounds were just, there's not even a word for it that I'm even comfortable talking about. Because my word for it is made up, and I always say it and people laugh, but it's the truth. They were ginormous. Okay? They were absolutely huge. Massive. And they had to be, because these beings that were inside of these mounds, where they were being buried before the Native Americans ever came, were massive. Okay? So these specific ones that I am referring to were here from just after the last ice age. And these guys, as far as Native history talks about them, appeared on the North American continent by way of the South American continent. And they came from the sea of the South American continent. Now, we're talking 10,000 years ago. And people are going to say, well, that's crazy. Why would the Native Americans keep that history, and how would they know? Well, first of all, these beings were the ancestors of the big 23-footers. Okay? These guys came through from the sea and came through South America and on up through North America. And they were huge. We kept record of them when we came onto this continent from one of their own people. And then it turned into a couple more of their people that were being assimilated into the Native American tribes. Because these guys were big. Okay, these guys were 10 foot, 12 foot tall. But they had an interest, twofold, in the Native Americans. Okay, they used the Native Americans for slaves, and they used them for breeding purposes, the ones that could withstand what they were dealing with. That's a nice way to put it. These guys were enormous, okay? So for them to come to the North American continent and claim the North American continent right after the last ice age, okay? There was still ice here apparently. And the story that I was told was that when they came up from South America, some stayed in South America because they preferred the weather and the lay of the land down there. But you have to remember, this was after the last ice age. You know, it just was just after it. So they came up through to the North American continent. Some tribes split off down there and stayed. Others came up here. What they found here was very strange. There were some people here, but they weren't like other people would expect them to be. These guys that were here were very small, very low-slung stature, easily taken over and manipulated. They conquered them no problem. Now, there again, people are going to say, well, what are you talking about, Kat? I've never heard of this. Actually, there are accounts of the settlers when they came, began clearing the land back east, and they were knocking these mounds down, and they were, digging up the land to build, to plant for crops, etc. Well, there are instances where they discovered graveyards, grave sites, massive grave sites, okay, of small people. And these people were buried in small coffins. Okay, so what I'm telling you is that they existed here previous to the Native Americans, okay? And when the giants came, these were the people that they tried to use and abuse, as was their custom. Bigger survives, bigger thrives, stronger lives, weaker dies. Now, these guys weren't too happy about it, but what are they going to do? There's nothing they can do. And if you remember, I said this planet is a learning planet. It's a teaching planet. Okay, so they have to learn. If they're going to stay here and adapt and thrive, then they need to figure out skills to deal with these giants. And the easiest way to deal with the giants was to go underground. They left the giants to the top up here. And these guys were raging, rampant nutcases. And I'm going to say it like that because that is exactly what they were. They were extremely hostile, very warlike, looking constantly to do battle, and for them to come in here and just immediately take over, think about that, take over the whole North American continent, because burial mounds have been found as far away as upstate Maine, all the way down to Washington State, clear over on the Pacific coast. Okay, so we're talking about things, these beings had conquered the whole North American continent. They were very tall. Like I said, they dressed themselves in leather. They had some form of copper that they were using as weapons and shields and books. They used mining techniques that we are very familiar with ourselves. There's a lot they did here on this North American continent to make it their home. And they had it to themselves for a number of years. I'm talking thousands of years, okay? So it was theirs. And as time went on, they had elaborate burial ceremonies, and they believed that they needed to put groups together, like with like. So when they buried their spouses, family members, tribal members, group members with them, they also put in others with them, such as slaves, wives, children, elderly. It didn't really matter, because if the head of that tribe, which was always male, passed, then it was believed that his children and the elderly, such as his parents, would be a burden on the tribe. So they were interred with him. And that's a terrifying thought, to think that. But then we realized that the Egyptians and the Mayans and the Aztecs, there's any number of people that buried slaves and wives with the man when he died. So it's keeping right informed. Human history, human habits that we do are not something new. Okay, we don't just develop something and say, oh yeah, this is the new norm. We tend to be very repetitive, in what we do in our day-to-day lives. So it just goes to figure, why would they think outside the box when it fits, the old adage, if it's not broke, don't fix it. And that's pretty much what they did. They would inter the wives, the slaves, the old people with him. And every now and then there were animals in the hills, such as horses. And people are going to say, oh, there were no horses here, Kat. Okay, I'm not going to argue with you on that. Because, as I've said before, archaeology is flawed. When you carbon date things, you're starting out on a flawed premise. And I'm going to stick by that. Okay, as someone who's very familiar with it, able to perform it, it doesn't always give you the best results. I can think of a couple different methods to use that would give you much better results for claims of certain animals not being on the North American continent. So, anyhow, I'm going to skip past that and say, with these guys being here for so long, before the Native American tribes showed up, they pretty much had the lay of the land, and they did like a lot of civilizations do. They ran themselves to ground. They began to proliferate and eat everything in sight on the North American continent. They were rampaging and crazy and chased the other peoples that were here underground, as I said. So these guys were just hellacious beings. And they did whatever they wanted to do, and they were very, very violent. So much so that when the Native Americans began to proliferate themselves here, it was a constant battle with these guys. And these guys are just a degenerated, de-evolved version of the big giants. So we're fighting with them, trying to have a way of life and coexist, but it's not working. They keep coming after the women and the children, for slaves and for food, and it just wasn't working. So the Native Americans, the indigenous, decided that they were going to find a way to wipe them out, which is what they did. If anybody's ever heard me talk about the legend of the Dogman, it explains exactly how they were created, why they were created, and how they wiped out the giants. Okay, now in wiping out the giants, I'm saying we decimated them to the point where any that existed were either killed or assimilated. So the only ones that could be assimilated into the Native American tribes were the friendlies, ones who weren't as aggressive, nasty, have a taste for human flesh type. So there were certain ones that were integrated into the tribes. And this being the case, the blood is very strong. It doesn't degenerate fully. Okay, no matter what, you're going to end up with a throwback every now and then, or you're going to end up with some form of mutation, such as 6 fingers. Okay, these things that were very indicative of the giants, are in the histories and the bloodstreams of the Native Americans now. And these guys that were here didn't have a way of embalming themselves per se. My understanding is that they did use some form of herb, and from the way that I have seen of examples of their skin, I'm suggesting that maybe it was a form of some sort of tannin that they were using, to a combination of tannin and smoking, to preserve their bodies. But by the time the settlers got here, you know, and started tearing the mounds apart to build their own cities upon, you know, and their own fields upon, it was so over. You know, these guys had disappeared pretty much. And when they started tearing the mounds open, because the bodies were not embalmed in any way, they had pretty much deteriorated over time. So what they found were skeletons, but when they were exposed to the air, many of them just fell apart, you know, and were no good, no use. There are a few out there that did survive, and I have seen a skull of one of them, and it really fascinated me because the patina on it suggested the tannin and the smoking to preserve it, and it actually did work. I mean, the rest of the skeleton, I don't know where it is, but obviously it did look like this form of preservation was used on them. So those giants, the red-haired giants that everybody's talking about, these are the ones that are descended from the 23-footers, the 26-footers, the 30-footers. And there are even more bigger than them. Okay? Those were previous to them. So our world has always had some form of giant being on it. And I'm going to say that with total seriousness here. We've had some form of huge, large hominid being on the face of this planet since it was made, since it was created. So that's going to be my lesson today. I want people to understand that, and I know this is going to be a long subject because I'm not doing the great big hour-long subjects on it because people told me that they were getting bored. And if I can't entertain you and keep you occupied, then I will just keep the videos short and sweet and to the point. So remember, the red-haired giants are descendants of the big 23-footers. And yes, these guys are a degenerated group of the descendants of them. So, were they cannibalistic? Very much so. By the time they got here, they were cannibalistic. As they degenerated even more, they became horrible cannibals. You know, they were eating people left and right. Were they warlike? Yes, they were. Did they have weapons? Yes, they did. You know, some of the remains of them that have been saved and are now put away in vaults show that they were very well familiar with sword making, copper, tin, you know. And I always like people, I tell my students, think about this. What does it take to get tin? You know, I mean, sure, you see it every single day when you open a can, but do you know what entails getting it? You know, I mean, it's very complicated. You know, you have to have something called cassiterite to get it. And there are only so many mountains in the world where you can find cassiterite to make tin. So it's a very unique process, and if you're interested in it, go on YouTube or go on Google and, you know, Google tin. You'll find that it's a very complicated process to make this. So you have to have some sort of intelligence level and the ability to implement what you have learned about this, I mean, it's just amazing the things to do to make swords, to make armor. So these guys were able to do that with copper. But as the years went by, they were a pretty closed off group here. Things began to degenerate. They were stealing the native women, trying to mate with them, and sometimes they were successful. The bigger women were able to take whatever they were doing to them. And I myself believe that's where you get the Khat people, get the bigger people from. For instance, my own children are very large. And quite easy to kick the snot out of somebody. They're very warrior oriented, and they have these capabilities and these passions. So I want people to understand that descendants of these guys run throughout all the Native American tribes because they did adopt them in. They tried to take them in and give them a home and integrate them. And to a certain extent, they succeeded. But now, what we have here is a degeneration of those giants that were not assimilated, that ran deep into the mountains to hide. Okay? And every now and then you hear a story about a 23-footer. But more importantly, what you're hearing about are the Steyama, the sand people. And these beings were here for a long time after the red-haired giants were gone. And these people, the Steyama, are descendants of the red-haired giants, mated with the indigenous swamp-dwelling people down south in the swamps down there. And down there they call them swamp apes. And that's what I'm going to end this lesson on today. So I hope that I've helped you in some way understand a little bit better our tangled history here. If you have questions, please let me know. In the meantime, I hope you have a great weekend ahead.